Why Catholic is made possible by generous patrons. If you're blessed by this podcast, consider supporting it by purchasing something from the Why Catholic merch shop on Etsy. Link is in the show notes. Original designs on sweatshirts, t-shirts, hats, decals, and more. Stay tuned to the end of this episode to hear how you can get a special discount. Thanks for supporting Why Catholic.
The year was 1571. The Islamic Ottoman Empire was quickly taking the world by storm. They had successfully conquered the Holy Land, Constantinople, Greece, and other parts of Eastern Europe. When the Ottomans, with their fierce naval fleet, conquered the island of Cyprus, which was an important port for the West, European leaders feared that their countries would fall next. The Pope at the time was Pius V, a champion during the Counter-Reformation. Knowing that the Ottomans would continue conquering the West and expanding Islam, Pope Pius V stepped into action. At the time, there was no unified Italy. The peninsula was just a group of little nations that included the Papal States. Pope Pius V organized a coalition called the Holy League, made up of nations of the Italian peninsula along with other European countries. The only way they stood a chance against the Ottoman Empire was through a unified effort. The Holy League's fleet, made up of 212 ships, one of the largest fleets since antiquity, pursued the Ottoman navy. While the Ottomans weren't necessarily looking for a fight, they were confident they could win. They had an astounding 278 ships, 66 more than the Holy League. On top of that, they were seemingly an invincible force, winning virtually every naval battle they faced. Knowing that the Holy League was outnumbered in an impending battle that was do or die for the Western Christian world, Pope Pius V encouraged everyone to pray the rosary. On October 7, 1571, the two navies faced off near the Gulf of Patras in Greece in what became known as the Battle of Lepanto. The immense naval battle lasted for 4 hours, and while it was a bloody war for both sides, the Holy League decimated the Ottoman Armada. 8,000 fighters for the Holy League were killed, while the Ottomans suffered 40,000 casualties, 5 times more than the Holy League. In the end, 87 Ottoman ships retreated to Constantinople, having lost 2/3 of its fleet. The Battle of Lepanto was immortalized in art and literature and is considered one of the most important battles in history. The Holy League's victory strengthened the papacy and Pope Pius V's legacy. He even gained popularity among Protestant Europe for defeating the Ottomans. Giving credit to Mary's intercession for the unprecedented and long-shot victory against the Ottoman navy, Pope Pius V instituted a feast day on October 7th called Our Lady of Victory, which was later changed to Our Lady of the Rosary. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. Since episode 108, we've been talking about the papacy. In the last episode, we looked at some of the bad popes in history that have left a stain on the chair of St. Peter. Today, it's time to turn the tide and look at some of the great popes in history, popes like Pius V. As I mentioned in the last episode, and as we saw with Pope Pius V's victory at Lepanto, for most of history, the pope served both as a political and spiritual leader. While the worst popes in history seemed to prioritize the political and the hedonistic while neglecting the spiritual, the great popes had a deep spiritual life, a gift of administration, and the ability to lead politically in a way that unified the world. Since I already highlighted St. Peter in episode 109, I'd like to begin with Pope Leo I, also known as Pope St. Leo the Great. It makes it easy to identify the great popes when they have the suffix great in their name. Leo was born around 400 AD in Tuscany. In his early 30s, he was ordained to the diaconate and would serve as a deacon for both Pope Celestine I and Pope Sixtus III. Leo was a gifted preacher and a theologian and a staunch defender of Orthodox Christianity. Leo's popularity was unquestionable. Emperor Valentinian III even requested him personally to help settle a political dispute. While he was gone on said diplomatic mission, Pope Sixtus III died, and on September 29, 440, Leo was elected unanimously as his successor, even though he was not physically present in Rome. In episode 90, I mentioned that the most divisive issue in the early church pertained to the nature of Jesus, which resulted in heresies like Arianism, Nestorianism, Monophysitism, etc. Leo, an astute theologian, wrote a letter known as the Tome of Leo to set the record straight on Jesus' nature as fully human and fully divine. With the growing tension in the Roman Empire caused by these theological divisions, in 449, Emperor Theodosius II called for a church council, the Second Council of Ephesus. However, Pope Leo's tome or letter was not only ignored, but the church leaders that delivered the Pope's letter were removed from their position by those in attendance at the council. This led Pope Leo to label the Second Council of Ephesus as a robber synod. When Emperor Theodosius II died and Marcian succeeded him, Pope Leo appealed to Marcian to convene another council. This became known as the Council of Chalcedon, which began in 451. Here, Leo's tome or letter played an important part in distinguishing orthodoxy from heresy. In fact, if you recall in episode 111, I referenced that letter as one possible example of papal infallibility. Ultimately, the Council of Chalcedon reiterated that Jesus was co-eternal and consubstantial with God the Father, fully human and fully divine in one person and one hypostasis. I talked about this extensively in episode 90 called the Hypostatic Union. In addition, the Council of Chalcedon also invalidated the Second Council of Ephesus, and this strengthened the office of the papacy. It repudiated the idea that emperors could call councils without the Pope's approval. Regarding his political success, Pope Leo the Great is best known for a standoff with Attila the Hun, the ruthless leader of Eurasian nomads who built an enormous empire and wreaked havoc on Christians. The historian Callinicus wrote, quote, "The barbarian nation of the Huns, which was in Thrace, became so great that more than 100 cities were captured and Constantinople almost came into danger and most men fled from it. And there were so many murders and bloodlettings that the dead could not be numbered. Aye, for they took captive the churches and monasteries and slew the monks and maidens in great numbers." End quote. In 452, Attila the Hun invaded the Italian peninsula and prepared to take Rome. A few delegates, including Pope Leo, were sent to dissuade Attila not to attack the city. There are conflicting stories as to how Attila was actually dissuaded. One credits Leo, saying that Attila was so impressed with him that he just withdrew. Another says that Saints Peter and Paul appeared over top of Leo with drawn swords, and Attila was so frightened that he left Rome. Either way, Pope Leo the Great is credited with stopping Attila the Hun from capturing and destroying Rome. Leo the Great served as pope from 440 until his death in 461, 21 years in all. In 1754, Pope Benedict XIV proclaimed Leo I a doctor of the church. Later, Pope Benedict XVI said that Leo's papacy was, quote, "undoubtedly one of the most important in the church's history," end quote. Let's turn our attention now to another great pope, Pope Gregory the Great. Gregory was born in 540, around a century after Pope Leo the Great. He was from a wealthy and aristocratic family in Rome. He even served as prefect of Rome for a time, which is to say he was the governor or mayor of the city. After his father's death, Gregory gave up political life, and having a deep respect for religious life, particularly the vow of poverty, Gregory converted his family's villa into a monastery dedicated to St. Andrew. He ended up building 4 monasteries over the course of his life. He was later ordained as a deacon. At the time, Rome faced a devastating plague that led to famine and crime. On top of that, it had been raided by the Goths, only to be retaken by Emperor Justinian I of the Byzantine Empire. As long as Rome was a political subject of Constantinople, many believed that the Bishop of Rome, aka the Pope, did not have authority over the Patriarch of Constantinople. In 579, Pope Pelagius II appointed Gregory to be ambassador to Constantinople, where he appealed to the Byzantine court to provide assistance to Rome, particularly military aid. After 6 years as ambassador to Constantinople, Gregory returned to his monastery in 585, where he intended to live out the rest of his life as a monk. However, after the death of Pope Pelagius II, Gregory was appointed by acclamation to the papacy. One of his first acts as pope was to write a series of letters disavowing any ambition to be pope. If you recall in episode 104, I mentioned a quote from G.K. Chesterton's masterpiece, Orthodoxy, where he said, quote, "We must take the crown in our hands and go hunting in dry places and dark corners of the earth until we find the one man who feels himself unfit to wear it," end quote. It was almost like Chesterton had Pope Gregory in mind when he wrote that passage. Pope Gregory did not have any ambitions to be the Bishop of Rome, yet, when he was appointed, he rose to the occasion. At the time, Rome was in shambles. Poverty, disease, and famine plagued the city. Unwilling to wait for relief from Constantinople, Gregory organized the church to provide for those in need. He raised money through the giving of alms and recorded every expense in journals. And mind you, this was centuries before the invention of accounting. He ordered deacons to identify the most impoverished and provide for them with relief in the form of food, clothing, and money. Those churchmen who were unwilling to do the charity work Pope Gregory demanded were quickly replaced with those who would. In order to provide for the starving in the city, Pope Gregory resorted to liquidating property and amped up the agricultural productions in papal-owned farms. Soon, grain, cheese, and meat began flowing into Rome and were given away for next to nothing. With a strong conviction on missions, Gregory sent the prior of his monastery, a man named Augustine, on a mission to the British Isles, specifically to introduce Christianity to the pagan kings there. That Augustine became known as Saint Augustine of Canterbury, the apostle to the English. Perhaps what Pope Gregory the Great is best known for is his liturgical efforts, particularly music. He reformed liturgical abuses and standardized some of the church's liturgy, and some of his reforms are still in effect today. He is credited with putting liturgy and psalms to music, and the church's official music is named after him, Gregorian chant. Upon his death in 604, Gregory was immediately canonized as saint by popular acclaim. He's considered the founder of the medieval papacy. A prolific writer, he authored over 850 letters. Many of his works still exist today. In 1298, when the Catholic Church began the practice of promoting doctors of the Church, Pope St. Gregory the Great was one of the first 4 to be given the honor. Included with him were St. Ambrose, St. Augustine of Hippo, and St. Jerome. That's some very good company. As of this time, Pope Gregory and Pope Leo are the only popes to be named doctors of the Church. While we could mention a number of popes who did great things during their papacy, including another pope with great in his name, Pope Nicholas the Great, we only have time in this short episode for one last great pope, arguably the greatest pope in history. Let's skip ahead to the 20th century to a pope of recent memory, Pope John Paul II the Great. Pope John Paul II was born Karol Joseph Wojtyla in 1920 in Poland. In October of 1942, during the time of World War II, he knocked on the door of the bishop's palace and asked if he could join the priesthood. Karol entered an underground secret seminary run by the Archbishop of Krakow. On August 6, 1944, known as Black Sunday, the Nazi forces rounded up and deported 8,000 young men in Krakow. Karol narrowly escaped by hiding in a basement and then taking shelter in the Archbishop's palace. Karol was ordained to the priesthood on All Saints' Day in 1946. In addition to his duties as a parish priest, he taught ethics at the local university. There he organized a group called the Rodzinka, which means little family. Initially about 20 young people, they met for prayer, philosophical discussions, and to help the disabled and sick. Eventually, the group grew to over 200. Father Karol had a love for ministering to students, and he'd take them on outdoor adventure trips like kayaking, biking, and skiing. In 1954, Father Karol earned a Doctorate of Sacred Theology. He wrote a series of articles on modern social issues for Krakow's Catholic newspaper, and in 1960 he published the book Love and Responsibility, which was a combination of philosophy and traditional Catholic teachings on marriage. In 1958, Pope Pius XII appointed Father Karol as an auxiliary bishop of Krakow. Beginning in 1962, now Bishop Karol participated in the Second Vatican Council, making contributions on 2 important works: the Decree on Religious Freedom, which in Latin is Dignitatis Humanae, and the Pastoral Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, which is Gaudium et Spes. In 1964, Pope Paul VI appointed Bishop Karol as the Archbishop of Krakow, and in 1967, at the age of 47, he was named to the College of Cardinals. In that same year, 1967, he played an instrumental role in the encyclical Humanae Vitae, which was a landmark document for the papacy denouncing abortion and artificial birth control. And in 1975, he helped draft the apostolic exhortation Evangelii Nuntiandi. When Pope Paul VI died in 1978, Cardinal Karol Wojtyla participated in the conclave that elected Pope John Paul I. However, with Pope John Paul I's untimely death only 33 days later, Cardinal Karol Wojtyla was elected pope. He accepted the office by saying, quote, "With obedience and faith to Christ my Lord, and with trust in the Mother of Christ and the Church, in spite of great difficulties, I accept," end quote. He took on the name Pope John Paul II to honor his predecessor and adopted the motto Totus Tuus, meaning totally yours, a dedication to the Blessed Virgin Mary. With a heart for youth ministry, in 1985, Pope John Paul II established a World Youth Day and presided over 9 of them. It's estimated that between 5 and 7 million people attended Mass at the 1995 World Youth Day in Manila, Philippines, where Pope John Paul II presided as celebrant. This is considered one of the largest gatherings in human history. Pope John Paul II traveled some 680,000 miles during his papacy, visiting 129 countries. In fact, he traveled more than all the previous popes combined. One of his significant focuses was on restoring relations with Eastern churches. In 2001, he visited Greece, the first pope to do so in 1,291 years. While there, he issued an apology for offenses the Catholic Church caused the Eastern Orthodox Christians, saying, quote, "For the occasions past and present, when sons and daughters of the Catholic Church have sinned by action or omission against their Orthodox brothers and sisters, may the Lord grant us forgiveness," end quote. Perhaps his most famous visit occurred in June of 1979, when he returned to his homeland of Poland, which was under communist control. At a large gathering, he urged the crowds to be not afraid, and they responded with, quote, "We want God, we want God, we want God," end quote. In the 2006 book, The Cold War and New History, author John Lewis Gaddis notes, quote, "When Pope John Paul II kissed the ground at the Warsaw airport, he began the process by which communism in Poland and ultimately elsewhere in Europe would come to an end," end quote. Pope John Paul II's subsequent visits to communist-controlled Europe are considered one of the leading factors for the fall of communism and the collapse of the USSR, and he never even fired a single weapon. Speaking of firing a weapon, Pope John Paul II was critically wounded in St. Peter's Square on May 13, 1981 in an assassination attempt by Mehmet Ali Akça, a member of a fascist Turkish militant group. Pope John Paul II recovered from the gun wound and urged the faithful to, quote, "Pray for my brother Akça, whom I have sincerely forgiven," end quote. After Akça was sentenced to life in prison, Pope John Paul II paid him a visit on Christmas Day in 1983. He prayed with him and forgave him, and the visit proved to be life-changing for the would-be assassin. Akça was released from prison in 2010, and in 2014 he returned to Vatican City and laid flowers at the tomb of John Paul II. In 2016, he even mentioned a desire to become a Catholic priest. It is difficult to sum up John Paul II's papacy in such a short time. His papacy, from 1978 to 2005, a total of 26 years, is the third longest in history. His teaching on ethics related to issues like abortion, the death penalty, birth control, the environment, etc., were influential in a time of rampant liberal modernism. He addressed and apologized for past abuses done by the Catholic Church. He addressed the clergy child sex abuse scandals and created measures of reform to protect youth. One of the major accomplishments of Pope John Paul II's papacy was the reform of the Church's legal practice. For the Roman Catholic Church, this was done through the publication of the 1983 Code of Canon Law. In addition, Pope John Paul II published the 1990 Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches, which standardized the legal practices for those in the Eastern Catholic Churches, creating a more unified Catholic Church. By the way, I did a whole segment on Eastern Catholicism in episode 63 called Not All Catholics Are Roman Catholic. Perhaps Pope John Paul II's most influential work was the publication of the Catechism of the Catholic Church in 1992. This was the first time that the Church had a standardized, comprehensive statement of beliefs consisting of scripture, council declarations, writings by church fathers, and so forth. Pope John Paul II died in 2005. His last words were, quote, "Allow me to depart to the house of the Father," end quote. He was canonized in 2014 by Pope Francis, and while there's no official process for giving someone the title great, it is a title many have bestowed on Pope St. John Paul II. There is no better word to describe his work as a pastor, a teacher, an administrator, a reformer, and a world leader than great. In closing, I want to reiterate something I mentioned in episode 105 called the Upside Down Kingdom. I think someone could listen to the last episode on the worst popes in history and say, see, this is why the papacy is a terrible idea. Look at how it can be abused. But these great examples in this episode demonstrate that the issue isn't the papacy. These great leaders were able to accomplish these great things because of the power given to their office. As we see the papacy develop to a place where the church recognizes the primacy of the chair of St. Peter and doesn't try to undermine it through constant political gamesmanship, we see how men like Pope John Paul II are able to utilize the office to change the world. The issue isn't the power given to the papacy. The issue of primary concern is who the church elects into that office. What type of character and charisms does that individual exhibit? Popes like Leo, Gregory, and John Paul II serve as examples of the type of leaders and characters that should sit on the chair of St. Peter. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.